Broadcasting from occupied territories, War of the Flea Media, it's the Reality Dysfunction Podcast. A space where a diverse group of brown folk from across the nation explore the political experiences and social future of our Chicano Latino community. Control the narrative. Resist the dysfunction.
Greetings, Dysfunctional. This is Dr. Ernesto back with another episode of the Reality Dysfunction. Today, I'm very pleased to be bringing to you a talk I gave on November 15th, 2014 at Prescott College. It was for the Masters Colloquium. The title of the talk is Why Peace is Impossible. I hope you enjoy it.
How's everybody doing? Good. All right. Tonight we're going to talk about, the title of the talk is Why Peace is Impossible. The role of language in meaning and conflict. And so, chose this graphic here. I thought it was appropriate. The enemy has no face. So, when we talk about peace, we talk about justice, and we talk about these different sort of concepts, and there are ideas that we sort of bandy around very freely, really. When you stop to think about it, you go to marches and you hear people chanting, what do we want? We want peace. What do we want? We want justice. When do we want it? Now, right? You really want it right now? I mean, is that really what we want right then? And I think that, these are important questions, right? Because when we think about peace and we think about justice, one of the things that we don't ever really consider is what I call the unsettling nature of language, right? Because language is about conflict, right? That's how we understand, that's how we as a society have chosen to make meaning, right? The other, the difference, the thing that it isn't, right? That's how we understand what things are by what they are not. And so when you think about that, it kind of puts a little bit of a different spin on things, right? So we talk about the unsettling nature of language. One of the things that we have to understand is that meaning is derived from difference, not sameness. We don't understand what things are because they're the same. We understand what they are because they're different. And that's important. When we talk about peace, that's important. We understand what peace is from what peace is not. Or we understand what we would like to think and believe peace is or can be by what it is not. And the other thing I think that's really important is this idea, it's not my idea, but that meaning is never fully present, but that is always deferred, always postponed. Meaning that no matter what it is that we are faced with, the situation, the idea, anything, that we can never fully understand the meaning of that thing. And in reality, we don't really want to. We don't want meaning to be present. Because when meaning is fully present in something, what state do you think that thing is in? Yeah, it's in the state of death, right? Because it's unchanging. There's nothing new that's coming from that one thing. And so meaning is present. Like the Latin language. It's a dead language, right? We can study it. We know the verbs. It doesn't change. It's what it is. Meaning is fully present in that. And so when we talk about things like peace and we talk about things like justice, we have to understand that meaning is deferred. It's not present. It's not all the way there. And so in this whole idea, it's a very famous line, why can't we all just get along? And I think that's a question that we ask ourselves, right? But again, really thinking about how language plays a part in the way that we interact with each other, the way that we try to understand, the way that we try to find a common ground, right? Because language is always a series of near misses. Well, you don't get what I'm saying. You're not following what I'm telling you, right? And the other person can hear you. I mean, they know what you're saying. But there's a difference, right? There's something that's lost between the words that come out of your mouth and the words that go in their ears. And that's where this meaning happens. But what Stuart Hall tells us is that although the essence of language is communication, and it depends on shared linguistic conventions and shared codes, it acknowledges that neither things in themselves nor the individual users of language can fix meaning in language. Things don't mean. I can't tell you, I can't say to you, this is what this means. And then that's it. If there's a disagreement, if there's a problem, if there's some sort of thing that everybody's agitated about, it's because we have all made that meaning together, right? We can't accept our individual responsibility or our group responsibility in terms of what things mean. And that has to do with the idea of peace, and that has to do with the idea of justice. We can't pass that off to other people because we're a part of a group that's having that discussion. And that discussion means that individual users cannot fix meaning. So, we talk about contradictions. And there's two ways really to think about what's happening here. So we talk about peace, all right? And it's this sort of elusive kind of idea that we see, and people sing songs about it, and everybody's working for it, and it's what we want in the world. We want peace, right? But when we stop and think about the things that we believe about the fundamental aspects of human nature, right? And then we think about how we're talking about it. So one of the questions here, one of the ways that we as a society, as a civilization, think about things is we think about them in terms of, or in what we would call metaphysical properties, right? Things are what they are, and that the essential nature of those things do not change. For instance, in the Christian religion, there's this idea of original sin, right? And because of this idea of original sin, humankind is flawed. That is our essential nature. That does not change, right? We are sinners. That's who we are. And we do bad things because we're sinners. Now, we can attempt to rise above that. We can try to change. We can try to be different. But essentially, metaphysically, that's who we are. And so when you think about that, you think about this idea of peace, how can we ever achieve peace if we're essentially flawed? So we're, in a way, striving towards something that as a society, as a civilization, that we've already determined is impossible to achieve, right? So the other way that we think about things, and this is more of a material way, is to think about the objects themselves. And if we go back to what Stuart Hall was saying, is that things don't mean. Objects don't have meaning. We assign those objects meaning. And so the internal contradiction in every single thing is its motion and development. Everything that's here in a materialist viewpoint has a meaning that is constantly evolving. So, as material objects, is the meaning of humanity one that's constantly evolving, or is it one that is stuck in a particular spot, right? It cannot change. And so as we walk through this, we think about peace, right? Is peace a moral or an ethical dilemma? Is it a moral or ethical concern? Because if it's a moral concern, if peace is morally based, then it falls more under this idea of metaphysical, right? This is something that we are. This is what we do because we have been instructed to do this thing by a higher power. If it falls under this idea of ethical, then it's a choice, right? We do this because we have examined these different outcomes And these are the choices that we're going to make. So again, just to really make sure that this is clear, the other, in short, is essential to meaning. Dialogue is how we make meaning, through talking to each other. We have this idea of peace. We have this idea of war. We have this idea of love. We have this idea of indifference, right? These are ways of having a dialogue, ways of thinking about it, setting up these things that in some ways are very useful, these sort of binaries. Oh, this one's really big. All right. So I don't know why the screen is like that. So you have this whole conversation, and then so somebody's sitting there and they think to themselves, okay, all right, Morales, all right, you can't just say that peace is impossible, because we see peace all around us, right? I mean, don't we live in a peaceful society? For the most part, right? I mean, like 95% of the time, isn't it peaceful? It's at like 5% of the time that things get out of hand and everybody's like, oh my God, what just happened, right? But 90% of the time, things are peaceful. Because why? I mean, are they peaceful because we're peaceful? Or are they peaceful because somebody's making us be peaceful? I mean, there's a couple of ways to look at it, right? So peace, the kind of peace that we experience in some ways, is a form of coercion. Because we know that there are repercussions for being unpeaceful, right? We see them all the time. Somebody is unpeaceful, they break the law, what happens to them? They go to jail, right? So people who are being unpeaceful go to jail. Is that true? Yeah. People who break the law, the state, right? The law and the state punish those people. They enforce this peace. It's not that we're all fighting with each other all the time, but there is an element of coercion in that, right? So when we think about a peaceful world, when we think about the sort of future that we want for little kids and people that are coming after us and all of this, right? We don't think about peace through coercion, right? We don't think, well, if we have a strong state, that will make things peaceful, right? I mean, who thinks that's a good idea? That we should have a strong state that enforces peace among its citizens? Yeah, see, nobody thinks that's a good idea, but that's totally what we have, right? That's how this works. That's how it works. That's how peace, not just in this country, but any country that has a state. Because what's going on in Mexico right now? And everybody's all like, oh, Mexico's a failed state. Why is Mexico a failed state? It's a failed state because there's a lot of violence? No, it's a failed state because the government can't enforce its laws. That's why it's a failed state. See, there's a difference between those things. And the distinction is important. In his book, Change the World Without Taking Power, The Meaning of Revolution Today, John Holloway says here that optimism not just of the spirit, but of the intellect is the aim. It is the very core of the world that obliges us to learn hope. And so we see these things, and we're all like, that's not good, right? That's not good. Can we do something about it? Maybe we can. And so that idea of doing something about it is where hope springs from. So you take a look at this picture, all right? This is a rough picture. This is legal violence. You know why we know this is legal violence? Because somebody would say, oh, what happened here is wrong, right? It's against the law. But none of these people went to jail. The state didn't repress them. It didn't come down on them, right? They hung these men. They took a picture of themselves while they were doing it. And then they all went home. There was no trial. There were no police there. The army didn't come in and intercede, right? This action, because if we see here what Ben Hameen is saying, he's saying that it is in the exercise of violence over life and death more than any other legal act that the law or the state reaffirms its right to exist, right? So when this happens, this is an affirmation of the state. When we talk about peace, and we talk about the state, and we talk about all of these wars that happen, right? These things that are happening are affirmations of the state. They're either affirmations of this state, or they are acts of what we call nation building, right? So when we build a nation, what are we doing? We're going into that nation. We take it over militarily. We reinvest in the military, not in the military, in the legal structure, in the infrastructure of that country. We build education, food, all of these things, right? And we say, you have a legal system now. And this legal system is what's going to handle the problems that occur on a daily basis. So when we look at this, all right? Now I want you to think, because you see this picture and you think to yourself, well, that was like 50 or 60 years ago, right? This was 1920 or something like that, okay? Where were you all the night that George Zimmerman was found innocent? I know where I was. I was sitting in my living room, freaking out in front of the television, right? My 25-year-old son calls me crying on the phone because he can't believe what just happened, right? That's legal violence, right? Because what's George Zimmerman saying? He's saying, I defended myself under the law, right? Was he found guilty? No. Was justice served? Well, yeah, actually it was. I mean, it was, but it wasn't, right? Because if we believe in the law, if we believe that justice and peace are established by the law, then that's exactly what happened that night. That's exactly what happened in his exoneration. So it goes back to the unsettling nature of language, right? I mean, because what we're saying is justice and peace, or what we hope is, or what the state says it is, right, is not something that any of us can agree upon. We cannot agree on those terms. That is why peace is impossible, because we cannot agree on those terms, not the way that the game has been set up. So, Ben Hameen continues on. He says that one might consider the surprising possibility that the law's interest in a monopoly of violence vis-a-vis individuals is explained not by the intention of preserving legal ends, but rather by the intention of preserving the law itself. The law and the state have no interest in what's legal or what's right or what's moral. It's simply there to preserve itself. And we know that because the state reserves for itself one act, and that is the ultimate act of violence over life and death. That act is reserved to the state. None of us in here can exercise that right. So when somebody kills on behalf of the state, they are acting on the part of the state. When a police officer kills someone, when George Zimmerman kills Trayvon Martin, he is acting on behalf of the state, particularly when he is found innocent. He is found within the parameters of the law. So we think about how all of this begins to play out. And we have this idea of peace. We think to ourselves, we can live peacefully with people. I'm a peaceful person, right? I don't go around fighting with people. Not very much anyways. Not fist fighting with them anyways. But, I try to get along. If I see my neighbor needs help, I go help my neighbor. And, I try to treat people how I want to be treated and all of that kind of stuff, right? I think that for the most part, that's how many of us try to live our lives. And I would say that that's a very peaceable way of living your life. I think that we're a peaceable people, right? I think especially the people that are in this room, we're peaceable people, right? But that doesn't have anything to do with peace. That's a different thing. That's a different beast, right? We can get along with each other, but we're not the state. We don't make the rules, right? Because remember, in language, meaning is fixed by a group of people, right? But through the state, that's not a dialogue, that's a monologue, right? And what the state is saying is, this is what you're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. There's no debate about it, right? You all can get in a room and argue it out, and then we'll make a decision according to the law. And then everybody will abide by that decision, right? That's peace. That's peace. And unfortunately, that's the kind of justice that we have come to expect in this society, right? That's peace and justice. When I go and I help my neighbor push his car out of a ditch, or I take food to somebody because I know they need it, or I just walk away from a situation that doesn't need to be inflamed any more than it already is, that's me being peaceable. And that's a good thing. But those are two different things. Peace, this idea of peace, of law, of justice, it's a foundation of society. And so if we look at this and we think about this, and I debated about this slide, but I think it's an important slide. Because if you look at history, right, even if you just take the Bible, the flood, the Exodus, the destruction of the world, right, it's our way of explaining how peace is won. Every time we talk about peace, we talk about the massive slaughter that precedes it. There is always, always, always a massive loss of life that precedes peace. And so it's kind of crazy, right? Because if you think about it, even this idea of redemption, like this idea that we as a group of people who are essentially flawed can be redeemed from this flawedness, right, by this sacrifice. I mean, when you think about that in terms of it being a martyr's action, right, this is a violent redemption. I mean, how do people become martyrs? They set themselves on fire, right? They willingly go to a gory death. They're torn apart, right? They're seeking something. There's some sort of thing that's happening within this act. So peace is always preceded by slaughter. Because the other thing is if we think about the way that we understand, the way we make meaning, we think about what the other is and how the other is essential to meaning. If there isn't this, then how would we ever understand this? Because these two things, they set each other off. Oh, it goes up here. I see now. Sorry. So yeah, to be clear, peace as a cultural or political ideology has achieved no long-lasting political or cultural successes in our world other than to create an indefinable concept or future that we struggle impossibly to achieve. The famous slogan, for a better world. Who's heard this slogan? That we do this for a better world, right? Is not ironically for a peaceful world or for a just world. It is for a better world. And if you ask me, I think that this idea of for a better world captures the essence of meaning deferred, right? Because it's a better world for what? How do we move towards that? It's a better world. It's not a peaceful world because we understand what peace is. We understand how peace is achieved. right? We understand how we achieved peace during World War II. We understand how we achieved peace after the Vietnam conflict, World War I. Any war, you understand how you achieve peace. You achieve peace by militarily conquering your enemy. That's how you achieve peace, right? In our particular case, we feel that peace was achieved because we won some of those wars. And because we won them, we feel peaceful. But the people who lost those wars do not feel that same sense of peace, right? So without meaning, peace can never, without meaning fully present, peace can never exist. Peace can exist at the end. At the end of this world, peace can exist because there won't be anything else to change, right? So we're stuck in this thing, right? This grind that just kind of keeps motioning through history. And I'll tell you that it's not as depressing as it might sound right now. I don't think that it is anyways. I think what it really is a way for us to think about who we are as a species and to figure out ways to rise above the sort of trap that we've put ourselves in by trying to define these different ways of being. So, Norberto Bobbio, a big favorite in this room, Norberto Bobbio, says in his book, Left and Right, the significance of political distinction, that the fact that left and right, and he's talking about politically left and right, are opposites simply means that one cannot be on both left and right at the same time. But it says nothing about the content of the opposing sides. I think that's an interesting point, right? You're on the left, you're on the right. What that means, Bobbio is saying, is that you can't be on both sides at one time. You can't be in two places at once, right? Doesn't say anything about if one side's right or one side's wrong. It is not enough to say peace and non-peace, war and conflict, because are opposites, because it eliminates the possibility of complication for either term. It's either peace or it's war. It's this or it's that. It's one of these two things. Pick. But it doesn't mean that either one, it doesn't tell us anything really about what those things mean. Because what we do know is that justice is a slippery term. It is a slippery term, and it means many things to many different people. So, I'm going to use this whiteboard here for a second. Bobbio says that, this is what Bobbio says. Bobbio says that with increased freedom, when you have a society and you increase the freedom, you decrease the equality in that society. So the more free you are, the less equal you are. What do y'all think about that? He even makes a little graph. He says freedom, equality. Right? It's almost a foregone conclusion the way he has it set up. So you have lots of freedom. Look at the society that we live in today. Do we have a lot of freedom? It's a very free society that we live in, right? Is there a lot of equality? It does not appear that there is a lot of equality, but there is a lot of freedom, right? There is a lot of freedom. People have choices. Like they can choose to do this, or they can choose to do that, or they can choose what school they go to, or how they want to spend their money, or where they want their taxes to go. You can choose all kinds of things, right? But in terms of equality, the choices are not as varied, they're not as wide. But what about if you have a society that's really equal? Do you have a lot of freedom? I mean, think about an example of that in our world today. Where do we see societies where everybody's equal? Or theoretically, they're equal? Yes?
I was just gonna say, I'm thinking about dress codes in school. If all the kids dress the same, then they're all equal. look at each other more equal.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Because
who's
they have
free?
less freedom to wear what they want.
Because who's free in school? Especially in school, right? In like high school. Ain't nobody free in high school, yeah. I mean, let's just be clear about that. You're absolutely right. There is no freedom in high school. So if you think about this, right? So you think about this and you think about this idea of totalitarianism, right? Does totalitarianism equal peace? Is peace totalitarianism? Right? I mean, if you have peace and you have justice, I mean, can you have the same amount of peace and justice? Yeah.
When you ask about what societies you might see that in, I'm thinking maybe like, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden. In theory, they have maybe more equality than we have in our country, and yet they also have kind of Western style beliefs.
Kind of, right? Kind of. Because they also, a lot of what we would consider our own personal wealth is managed by the state for them, right? So it's, but I think those are good examples of places I think that are trying to do that, right? I mean, when I was thinking of this, I was thinking of really of a lot of places that we would consider war-torn, right? I mean, if you have a war-torn country, in some ways there's a lot of inequality in those countries because it could, I mean, it's a serious situation for everybody, right? But there's not really a lot of freedom. And so I think it's the same thing in terms of peace and in terms of justice. And you might say, how can you say that? I will refer you back to Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, right? There is an element of justice that is in that story. I mean, I don't agree with it. And I'm sure that most of you in here don't agree with it. But that doesn't change the fact that the law was followed, the law was served, right? But this act of justice does nothing to promote peace. So you have these two, hold on a second, there's hands going up everywhere. Hold on, go ahead, Peter.
But I don't think we're talking about the justice you're describing as collectively understood justice does not strike many of us in this room as justice. And we would also similarly argue that this peaceable society we have is not a peaceful society. But I could imagine somewhere in some fantastical circumstance that a truly peaceful society can be similarly just. It's just probably nowhere found on.
I mean, I agree. I agree that in us, I agree that I can imagine that can exist. I agree, and I think that's really the key to this whole thing, right? Is that we can imagine that can exist, and I think that the track record of humanity shows that if we can imagine it enough, and enough of us begin to imagine it, that we can make that a reality. Yeah. Good luck with that, brother. Oh, good.
I think I'm just struggling a little bit with the terminology of like freedom versus equality. For example, like, so a state goes up on the debate of like gay marriage, and the idea is to push forward the bill for gay marriage, and if that goes through, I see that as a step forward towards equality for the LGBTQ community. But I don't necessarily see that as like a decrease in freedom.
So just real quick, one thing to keep in mind about what Bobio is saying and what I'm also trying to say, and I think that Peter, in his comment, started marching towards that, is that this is about society as a whole. It's not about individual causes or ideas or anything like that. This is about the whole shooting match at one time. So I would agree with you on the example that you brought up, but I would say that example is too small to fit into what it is that we're talking about here, because it doesn't constitute in any way the whole of society.
Could you potentially give me a learning picture?
Freedom, equality. That's as big as I can go on that one. Yeah.
Well, and I wanted to say that freedom, I think, is contextual. So it's referring to freedom in a particular understanding of individual opportunity and choice, right? So it kind of is a common sense relationship. The more individual freedom that there is, right, access to individual rights, the more that people are going to be pursuing those rights and interests separate from each other, right? And then there's more potential for equality, right?
Yeah. So you have, and again, I got a little bit ahead of myself in the slides, well, behind myself in the slides. If freedom and equality cannot exist equally, then what does that mean about peace and justice? And I would argue that it means the same thing. We can have a just society, or we can have a peaceful society. Or we can have a peaceful society, or we can have a just society, right? But remember, justice is blind, theoretically, right? There's a blindfold on. And so this idea of justice, right? And justice, the way that we've set it up, I see some puzzled looks in the room. So we procure justice through law. That is a very important point to keep in mind, right? If somebody injures my family, okay, I don't ride out in the middle of the night and shoot up their house. That's not justice. Well, at least that's not what we've agreed that justice is, right? What we've agreed that justice is that I call the police and that I lodge a formal complaint against those individuals. And then the police conduct an investigation, and then they make a determination about whether or not a law has been broken. And as a result of that determination, charges are filed against an individual. See, this is the path of justice in society. I'm not arguing against it. I think it's a lot better than riding out in the middle of the night and shooting up somebody's house. I do believe that, right? But when we say justice, or when I say justice, that's what I'm talking about, right? And peace. How does this peace, like we have peace, we have justice. Same thing, freedom, equality. So that type of justice doesn't necessarily promote peace. Not really. It might keep people peaceable, but it's not going to promote peace within a society, right? George Zimmerman's exoneration from his murder of Trayvon Martin provided justice in a certain sense, but it did not provide peace. It will not bring peace. That justice will not bring peace. Hey, you can run an experiment anytime you want to. Just get 5 people in a room and ask them a question.
So the Trayvon Martin incident is causing a lot of political activism and a lot of stirring and I don't want to use the word war, but discontent, and I can relate that to it, kind of in a way. Do you think that after the discontent blows over, it'll bring more peace?
I mean, no. I don't think it will, because I think that in a case like that what we see is that there are fundamental issues that cannot be addressed the way that we talk about them. Because as long as there are people who can say justice was served, even this then becomes the question, right? Is this justice? Is this what we want? Is this how we want to define our society, right? This kind of peace, right? Because, yeah. All right. Does that help, or is that good? Okay. So this is an excerpt from a piece that was written by Ricardo Flores Magón, who was one of the intellectual pillars of the Mexican Revolution, and was printed in his newspaper in 1910. And Magón writes that, and so to preach peace is a crime. To preach peace when the tyrant imposes his will and humiliates us, when the rich extort us to the extent of turning us into slaves, when the government, big business, and the church kill all aspiration and all hope. To preach peace under such circumstances is cowardly, vile, criminal. Peace in chains is an affront that should be refused. There is peace in the dungeon. There is peace in the cemetery. There is peace in the convent. but this peace is not life. This peace does not elevate. It is the peace of Porfirio Diaz, the peace in which the eunuch thrives and the citizenry prostitutes itself. It is the peace of the pharaohs, the peace of the czars, the peace of the Caesars, the peace of the oriental satraps. Let such peace be damned. So Magone was pretty clear, right? He's like, this is the situation that we're in 1910 in Mexico. This is an interesting little passage, and partially the reason that I picked it is because I think that if you were to take this and sort of make all things equal for the language, and then look at a lot of the sort of globalization and neoliberal stuff that's being written now, that you would see a lot of overlay, right? And so we think about how that makes people feel, right? And so I actually chose this graphic because when I read this statement in a book by Slavoj Žižek. The book is called Violence. And Žižek is making some really, I think, important points, but it kind of blew my mind, so I thought I would use these bombs. It's not like a violent thing. It's like all about what's going on inside my head. So Žižek is saying that resentment is the refusal to normalize oppression. It's an interesting little statement, right? Because when we think of resentment, we think of people who are petty, right? Who can't let it go, who are just so upset by the hand that's been dealt them in life, right? That they just rage against everybody, and they're just small, pathetic individuals, right? They're resentful, you know? You know what I mean? You've seen it, right? That Elvis song, what he says, an angry young man in the city, right? Born in the ghetto, grew up to be an angry young man. Actually, I wonder why. But what's that guy angry about, right? I mean, because, you know, you got to let it go, right? You have to learn how to overcome. You got to rise above. You got to, you know, make applesauce out of apples. Or no, lemonade out of lemons. But Žižek says that resentment is the refusal to normalize oppression. That's a crazy statement, right? Because what that means is that people who are resentful aren't small and pathetic. They just don't want to take it anymore. They're all like, this is stupid, right? This isn't right. This isn't normal. The way you treat me is not normal, right? And I will not participate in the normalization of that oppression. I'm not going to make it okay. It's not ever going to be okay. And every time you see me, you're going to know that it's not okay for you to act like that, right? That's what this is. So he also writes here, he wrote the part that's in red. I wrote the part that's not in red. But he writes that violence is never just abstract violence. Žižek says that nobody ever commits an act of violence just because. What he says is, just because you don't know why they're doing it doesn't mean they don't have a reason to do it, right? He says that the viewer lacks a clear picture of what is going on, and that even the most brutal violence is an enacting of a certain deadlock or a symbolic deadlock. That is why people engage in violence, because they are deadlocked. They do not know which way to go. And so this is what they do. This is what happens, right? You think about and so we think about resentment, and we think about this deadlock that Žižek is talking about, that he's saying is really what the cause of this is. So when we're locked in this struggle, right? And we go back to this idea of opposites. And we think through, once again, how language sets us up for this deadlock, right? Because we think about life, we think about our options most of the time in terms of binaries, right? It's either this or it's that, right? And we think to ourselves, what's the benefit of a binary? Like we say, what is the opposite of peace? Was war the opposite of peace? I don't know if war is the opposite of peace. I don't know if that's true. I think that sometimes people say, what's the opposite of love? And, everybody will say, well, it's hatred. But I would argue that love and hatred have a lot in common with each other, right? So, I mean, can you really say those things are opposites, or are they just sort of, along a spectrum, right? War, peace, the opposite of peace, disagreement, hate, hatred, discord, agitation, disharmony, distress, fighting, frustration, upset, war, worry. These are the opposites of peace. All of those, that big old long list of words is the opposite of peace. Now, what that tells us about language is that language is a very imprecise tool, right? It does not mean ever what we want it to. Ever. And even through our own sort of inability to make ourselves understood, the next hurdle is for the people who are listening to us to make sense of the gibberish that we're talking, right? And so when we think about this and we think about what's the opposite of peace, we think about what is the purpose of a binary. I mean, how, I think, do we begin to reimagine peace, war? Okay, there you go. You're either at peace or you're in war. That's the world right there, right? So it's the same thing. Man, woman. Is that right? I mean, who said no? Somebody over here said no. You said, why do you say no?
Because it's not a binary.
It's not a binary, right? How many of you in here agree that it's not a binary? Okay. But we don't have any problem with this. I didn't hear anybody yell no when I wrote this up here, right? I mean, I agree. This is not a binary. And we have, over the years, trained ourselves. We have trained ourselves to look at this relationship in a different way, right? How are we training ourselves to look at this relationship in a different way? If we understand the fragility of language, right? Our own basic inability to really be able to understand what other people are saying when they say peace or they say war. But we know, we make those allowances. You have peace, you have war. What do you have in between? You have everything in between. Everything in between. They have, there's a book in there. Could you grab it for me? So when we think about this in terms of what does it mean? What do the binaries, what do they help us to do? Yeah, thank you, sweetie. I want to read to you. This is a book by a guy named Chris Hedges, who's actually written quite a few books on this subject. Mr. Hedges is a war correspondent, and this particular book, I think, is very powerful. He has written about his experiences in Yugoslavia, and he relates this one story. Is war is a force that gives our lives meaning. And so, but don't let the title fool you. This book is not in any way, shape, or form advocating war. I think that Mr. Hedges is doing a really good job of trying to have a sophisticated conversation about peace and about war and about the way that we think about our lives, particularly when we're in situations like that. So he writes that, I sat one afternoon with a Bosnian Serb couple, Rosa and Drago Sorak, outside of the Muslim enclave of Goradzi, where they once lived. They poured out the usual scorn on the Muslims, but then stopped at the end of the rant and told me that not all Muslims were bad. They said, it was their duty to admit. And then he goes on to talk about how the city that they lived in came under siege, and how their sons were killed in this fighting, and how they were forced to move. And then they talk about their granddaughter that was born. And it picks up here. 5 months after Zoran's disappearance, that's their son, his wife gave birth to a girl. The mother was unable to nurse the child. The city was being shelled continuously. There were severe food shortages. Infants, like the infirm and elderly, were dying in droves. The family gave the baby tea for 5 days, but she began to fade. She was dying, said Rosa Sorak. It was breaking our hearts. Fejik, meanwhile, the husband, this is their Muslim neighbor, was keeping his cow in a field on the eastern edge of Gradzi, milking it at night to avoid being hit by Serbian snipers. On the 5th day, just before dawn, we heard someone at the door, said Rosa Sorak. It was Fadil Fejik in his black rubber boots. He handed up a half liter of milk. He was Muslim. He came to the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Other families on the street began to insult him. They told him to give his milk to Muslims, to let the Chechnik children die. He never said a word. He refused our money. He came for 442 days until my daughter-in-law and granddaughter left Gradzi for Serbia. The Soraks eventually left and took a house that once belonged to a Muslim family in the Serbian-held town of Kopaksi, 2 miles to the east. They could no longer communicate with Fejik. The couple said they grieved daily for their sons. They missed their home. They said they could never forgive those who took Zoran from them. But they said also that despite their anger and loss, that they could not listen to other Serbs talking about Muslims or even reciting their own sufferings without telling of Fejik and his cow. Here, Chris Hedges says, is the power of love. What this illiterate farmer did would color the life of another human being who might never meet him long after he was gone. In his act lay an ocean of hope. So it's the same as what John Holloway is telling us, right? Is that we examine the horrors of this world to teach ourselves hope. This story does the same thing. And so when we read stories like this, and we all know stories like this, right? All of us do. And yet we persist in this idea that peace and war are all or nothing propositions. And that is simply not true. It is not. And as we begin to re-examine our commitment to peace, because I think that we should re-examine our commitment to peace, right? We have to begin to remember stories like this. We would call these stories simple acts of humanity, okay, right? Or heroism, right? All of those things. But all of those things fall somewhere on this scale. Because to say that it was not, the participants were not engaged in war is not true, right? To say that they were somewhere on the scale is, though. And so as we begin to rethink this, we have to reject this idea of binaries. We have to put that in the dustbin of history where it belongs. And I think part of the way that we do that is by really rejecting the metaphysical nature of humanity. I personally do not believe that we are sinners born to die. And, well, we're going to die, but we weren't born to die because we sin. We're born to die because we're human. And we have the capacity from the beginning to do something great, to be a part of something greater than ourselves. And I think that thing that we're a part of that's greater than ourselves is the human race, right? So how do we think about uplifting this? How do we do this? And I think that one of the ways that we do that is by rejecting this idea of morality, right? By saying that we are going to make choices. We are going to make informed choices about why we do the things that we do. Not because we've been commanded to do them, not because we fear retribution, right? Not because we think that we'll be eternally damned or that we're displeasing someone, but we make ethical choices about what to do, about how to proceed in peace and how to proceed in war. How do we fight? And we make those choices. When we think about ethical thinking, what we have to understand is that in order for a decision to be an ethical decision, there has to be at least two choices. If there's only one choice, it's not an ethical decision. There has to be at least two choices, and they have to have two valid and reasonable options, okay? The choice should be value-based, drawn on a framework of ethical philosophy rather than for personal gain or reward. The choice should include others in the process of true consultation. When you make a decision, you consult other people, right? Because every decision that you make impacts other people. So you have to talk to other people about what you're doing. How often do we see the peace of our communities disrupted by individuals who make decisions for everyone, right? That is not peaceable. Forget peace, that's not peaceable, right? That's no way to act towards other people, right? So the choice should include others in the process of consultation. The choice must be explained and defended to others. Ethical thinking is a combination of wits and values, not simply one, as in the law, or the other, as in religious morality. The law is not an ethical thing. The state is not an ethical thing. They make decisions by themselves. This is the law. You steal, you get punished for it. You kill someone, you go to jail, maybe. Right? Maybe you go to jail. If you're found guilty under the law, then you'll go to jail. But if you're not found guilty under the law, then you won't go to jail, right? That is not a process that must be explained and defended to others. That is a situation where a decision is made. That is unethical. So when we think about this, just to sort of bring it home, this part a little bit anyways, morality, belief in divine and revealed truth is absolute, right? Morality is absolute. Thou shalt not kill. It doesn't say thou shalt not kill except for that guy that's crawling through your window at 3 o'clock in the morning, and if you want to smoke him and you can get to your gun fast enough, go ahead and do it, right? That's not. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say thou shalt not kill unless. It says thou shalt not kill, right? That tells us that the world is a fixed place, right? That humanity is essentially corrupt. That is who we are. That is our nature, unchanging. It calls for obedience. It says that there is one truth. We hear this all the time in the world today, right? Not just in other countries. We hear it right here in the United States. There is one religion. There is one truth. There is one way of being right. It's all about that one way. That is morality. Ethics is a belief in a rational choice. It allows for multiple options because morality does not allow for multiple options. It allows for one option. That's it, just one. Sees the world as flexible, skeptical, independent, believes the better argument. And now, because we try to do things ethically, does that mean that we always do them right? No, it does not mean that. But it does mean that we're making the decision for ourselves. And that's important, I think, to us as a species to be able to own the mistakes that we're making. Instead of saying, well, you know how people are. No, actually, I don't know how people are. How are they? Really, how are they? Are they all like that? Or do all of them don't think as much as, whatever? It's, how are they? See, that's the thing, is that we don't know how people are. So, as we think through these ideas of ethical decision making, of what it means to be peaceful, what it means to exist on this scale. And I think that this part is important, right? Because if we look at the way that how protest is structured, we see the mass action. And I think that within that whole idea of mass action, that really what we see is a plea on the part of the individual, right, for annihilation. I mean, we're trying to figure out a way to be subsumed into all of this and to become part of something that's bigger. And when we look at this idea of martyrdom or self-immolation, right, these are totally acts of annihilation. But they're also touted as the ultimate acts of those who are seeking peace. But they're the most violent acts that are perpetrated. And just because they're perpetrated on themselves doesn't mean that they're not violent. They're totally violent. So we have these moments of ultimate violence clearly demonstrate, I believe, the ineffective nature of peaceful protest as a means of transformation. It may be a means of remediation. It may be a means of reformation, but it is not transformation. If the state is upheld by the force of law, by the force of violence, then the state cannot be undone by nonviolence. It's not possible, because states are not founded in nonviolence. They're founded in violence. It always gets real quiet in the classroom at that point too. And I think that this is important. Albert Camus in his writing, and Camus was a French existentialist who fought on the part of the French resistance during World War II. And he writes in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, he says that there's but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Camus says that the only question that is before us is, do we live or do we die? That's it. You can sweep everything away. Do we live or do we die? And Camus is saying is that when we come to the point when we believe that there's nothing to live for, then we die. And we commit suicide. And so I think that's particularly important when we think about these issues of martyrdom and self-immolation, right? Because there's an argument that says that those individuals did that because they believed in something. I think that Camus is arguing against that, and I agree with Camus. This is not peace. We look to the future. In a very interesting book called Out of the Mountains, The Coming Age of the Urban Guerrilla, which is written by David Kilcullen. Just this year, it was released this year. Kilcullen says that there are 4 megatrends of the future. He says this is what will define the 21st century. Population growth, urbanization. This third word means cities, giant megacities are going to grow on the coast. And connectedness. This is what we're looking at in the 21st century, right? He says that trends are clear. More people than ever before in history will be competing for scarcer and scarcer resources in poorly governed areas that lack adequate infrastructure, and these areas will be more and more closely connected to the global system so that local conflict will have a far wider effect. It is not a pretty picture that David Kilcullen paints of the 21st century. But I think it's fair to note that David Kilcullen is a counterinsurgency specialist and has spent his entire life traveling the globe fighting against movements, right? So he has a certain perspective on this. But Kilcullen isn't the only one that thinks these 4 things are what will define the 21st century, right? So part of what we have to think about as we begin to reformat our ideas of peace and we begin to reformat our ideas of justice, is how do they interact with these things right here? How do we at Prescott College, right? And this is a conversation that we had this past Monday. And I think the point that my colleague, Dr. Sherman, made during that meeting is an important one, right? What does a liberal arts education look like in the 21st century? How do we begin to revamp the way that we're teaching about the world, the way that we're thinking about the world, right? Because things are changing. There is a level of connectedness in the world that we have never as a species experienced before, or even the idea of competing for these resources. So how do we begin to do that? Peace is not the absence of war. Peace is not justice. Peace is not freedom. Peace is indefinable, the way that we have set up the parameters of the conversation. I'm not saying that it's ever or always indefinable. I'm not saying you should go buy a gun or bullets to go with the gun, right? I'm not saying that we're doomed to die in some sort of raging conflict where we all have our hands at each other's throats. What I'm saying is that the conversation that we're trying to have about peace and about justice belongs to the 20th century. That we have to, right, as a body, as a group of people, we have to begin to think about how peace is not this, it's this, right? It's not a binary. It's not. It exists on a scale. We have a lot of peace. Do we have a lot of justice? Do those two things have to be that way? Can they exist together? I don't know. But I think it's a conversation that's worth having. I think it's a conversation that's worth having here. So that's really like that? I just figured out how to do that. Yeah. So you have, I think that what I would say, and this would be kind of my challenge to you all, is this, is as a collective body of scholars, right, how do we at Prescott College bend our sort of collective imagination, right, to sort of reach that point that was talked about earlier, to think about that place where peace and justice can coexist with each other, where freedom and equality can coexist with each other, right? And that's sort of my challenge that I throw out to all of you, not just to the students, but also to my colleagues on the faculty. How can we reformat the learning that we're doing here to really sort of try to reach towards that, right? Because, I mean, if you talk about a reformation of how liberal arts are taught in the 21st century, what could be a greater accomplishment than adding to the debate or the discourse around peace? I don't think there's a higher goal that we could strive towards. So, thank you very much. Yeah. Okay. Questions? No? Y'all want to take a couple minutes to think about it? Haley, what's up?
I'm wondering, I've spent
the past decade of my career in community development operating off the statement, if you want peace, work for justice.
Yeah.
And I feel like what I've understood from this talk is that you're saying those two things exist moving away from each other on this diagram. Am I misunderstanding what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is, you're not misunderstanding what I'm saying. But to be clear, what I'm saying is that the way that we understand and that we make meaning with each other through dialogue, through language, the way that the conversation has been set up is that, yes, those two things are moving away from each other, or that they can. And that has to do with that has to do with our reliance on the law, on the state, and thinking of new ways to reformat those.
Well, I think this is a fascinating new paradigm. So I really appreciate you for putting that forward. And if you want peace, work for justice is, is a catchphrase, and I get it, but it does represent, a model that I think we've all been functioning off of for quite some time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's, how should I say? Like, I don't want people to, I hope that I didn't discourage anybody. That was not my intent at all. And I know that I didn't discourage you, but I don't want anybody to walk away from here thinking, oh man, this guy, that was depressing, because I think the point is that until we can accept responsibility, like really we can accept responsibility as a species for these ideas, and we can examine them, and we can say, okay, when we say this is what we're talking about, right? This is the problem. And so we have this here, we have this there, and then we can begin to pull it apart, and we can begin to say, okay, how are we going to undo this? Like, how are we going to reformat this? How are we going to make it so that it's not an either or proposition, but that it is, it's the same way that we have begun to understand man and woman and straight and gay, right? That I think what we need to do is we kind of need to, we need to queer peace, right? We need to make it so that we need to put it in a space where we can say, okay, this is different than the way that we've thought about it. And so now we're going to have a conversation about why it's different. And so the conversation starts there. It starts with why it's different. Not why it's the same or why it's the same as this or that, but why it's different and why that's okay and that's good.
This is The Reality Dysfunction.